What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? What does academy have to do with the church? Our instruction is from the porch of Solomon. There is no need to combine Christianity with Stoic, Platonic, or Aristotelian philosophy. So writes Tertullian at around year 200. Tertullian was a brilliant writer, the founder of Latin Christendom. He was the first Christian writer wrote in Latin. And he took this absolutely certain position that Greek civilization has to be totally rejected. Of course, it was a little bit unfair because he was an extremely well-educated person and used this Greek civilization to attack it. But it so happened that Christianity did not follow Tertullian's advice. Roughly at the same time, in Alexandria, there was a large catechetical school created by Clement of Alexandria, which tried to combine classical learning, the Greek learning, with Christianity. The position of this school was quite different. The greatest member of this school, a person by the name of Origen, a great Christian thinker who lived roughly at the same time as Tertullian, let us say the year 200 when he started his major works. He lived another 40 years. He took a very different position. His position was expressed in his famous letter to his disciple Gregory, where he says that as philosophers use mathematics, astronomy, and other sciences to build philosophy, so we should use philosophy and therefore other sciences to understand the scriptures. And after that, he gave this beautiful illustration by using a story from Exodus. He said, when Jews were leaving Egypt, Moses told them to go and borrow the precious things, gold and silver, from their neighbors. This, by the way, for centuries was a major problem, at least for Christian theologians. How do you explain this rather remarkable act where God tells the Jews, go and steal your neighbor's precious metals? Origen, as it was his custom, would read a philosophical, symbolical interpretation. He said that what it actually means, and I'm sure he knew perfectly well that it was not the intent of the writer of Exodus, but he realized that there are greater sense in the world than just the original sense of the writer of Exodus. He said that what is meant is borrowing the great knowledge. Of course, first, Moses borrowed it from the Egyptians, and so should Christians borrow all the knowledge from the classical philosophers, from people like Plato. So that starts this process of integrating, combining two things, Athens and Jerusalem. What Tertullian said was impossible actually did happen. The synthesis of these two things started, of course it was attacked again and again through history. One of the main ideas of the Reformation was liberating Christianity from all this Hellenistic influence. Again, they did not succeed. Even the second generation of what is known as Lutheran Orthodoxy had to rely on Aristotle. We will get to Reformation eventually, one hopes. So the great, here we have to go through, I will skip the 3rd century and go into the 4th century, a great period of what is known as patristic philosophy. There were a bunch of very great thinkers, both in the East and the West, who were educated in Greek learning or Latin learning in the West, and who expressed multiple dimensions of Christian theology and in using these means. If you go to most great cathedrals in Europe, where they have great cathedrals, you might see the statues invariably of four great doctors or great fathers of the East and 4 great doctors and fathers of the West. Middle Ages liked systematic approach, so there were 4 great fathers here and 4 great fathers there. What are their names again? Once upon a time, every civilized person, once upon a time, say 100 years ago, would actually know the names. Now we live in the Dark Ages, so I'll have to remind you of the names you probably never heard. So the 4 great fathers of the East are Athanasius, Basil the Great, Gregory Nazianzen, and John Chrysostom. They did remarkable things. They created a legacy which Byzantium carried for centuries, and then other Orthodox churches built their understanding of the world. The important thing to know is one of them, Basil the Great, wrote a remarkable text which sort of determined the cultural situation in Byzantium for centuries to come. He wrote what is known as the letter to young people like you, some of you are still young, about Greek literature. Again, the 4th century, Christianity becomes official religion of the state. What do we do with Greek culture? And he comes with very, very firm recommendation. We study it. Yes, you have to learn Homer. Right? Sort of basically, whatever I have been telling you up to a certain point about Greek knowledge is exactly what he told his young audience. Learn the Greeks. We have to base our understanding of the scripture on Greek learning. It's useful. And that indeed, we will be talking a little bit more about Byzantium in this course, not much. I mean, I sadly enough do not have time. But it is quite clear that determined a cultural sort of policy of the Byzantine Empire. Everybody had to learn fundamental Greek texts. The education was not based on the Bible, but was based on Homer. Of course, people learned the Bible, but the primary educational text for the next, say, 1100 years, till 1453, when Turks decided to change the curriculum, was based on Homer. We have to acknowledge that eventually sort of the educational system in Byzantium became quite different from educational system in, say, Athens, especially classical Athens. It was somewhat restricted to the upper echelon of the society. Yet if you lived in Constantinople, if you attended imperial school or patriarchal school, 2 great universities in Byzantium, you became very well educated. The majority of the population were losing the connection somebody is beeping, was losing the connection with classical civilization. But one of the great things Byzantium, there are two great things Byzantium did, but one of them was to preserving classical culture so that Europe, Western Europe, could get it during the Renaissance. It's also important to remember that Byzantium saved Europe because it protected it from rather non-European civilizations which were attacking Europe for centuries. First Arabs and then the Turks. It was the bastion of Christendom in the East. We'll talk again. The story will concentrate mostly on the West, but we have to remember the great role of Byzantium there. So now, before we sort of go any further, we have to talk about the Western fathers. Remember the four, I named the four great fathers of the East, but there are also four great fathers of the West. And they are Saint Ambrose of Milan, Saint Jerome, the great translator of the Bible into Latin, Saint Augustine, and Saint Gregory the Great. Gregory the Great is later, most of you probably at least heard of Gregorian chant, which is attributed to his work and is the foundation of Western musical canon. So, out of these four fathers, one is special, and that is Saint Augustine. He is special because of enormous body of his work and his influence on the West. In many respects, the most influential thinker affecting Western civilization is Augustine. It's not, you say, oh, Alex, this is propaganda, somebody else. No, it's not a propaganda. I mean, anybody agrees this is. Again, I'll say the fact. Somebody is going to send me angry letters saying, Alex, your facts are just your beliefs. Yes, but they're also universally acknowledged by anybody who studied European civilization. He wrote enormous amount of works. Sort of covering them is utterly impossible, even if you teach a whole course on just Augustine. Many volumes of letters, about 500 of them. There are enormous amount of sermons. Some of them are beautiful. They're folio, large folio volume of just his sermons on the Psalms. Right? Very beautiful. There are lots of works defending Christianity against other religions, mostly against Manichaeans. Manichaeans, we will talk in a second about them. He was intimately familiar with them because for about 15 years he was a member of Manichaean Church. So he wrote many works against Manichaeans and then against many Christian sects outside of Catholic Church, Donatists, and then his major work against Pelagians. Pelagius was a British monk, the first great contribution of English-speaking people or British people. There was no English language, of course, at that point. Was a contribution of this great heretic called Pelagius. And Augustine wrote many works directing against him. Any subject under the sun, huge amount of work. His main theological treatise is the book called On Trinity, indeed a very great theological book, but we will not talk about it. His general book on civilization, which he did write, and I would have attempted to cover it except for its enormous size and difficulty, is called The City of God. De Civitate Dei, which was extremely popular throughout Middle Ages. For example, that's the book Charlemagne, the great emperor of whom we will talk later on, would read every day. But there is one book by Augustine you must read, because it is a very special book. It is a book which would allow you to see the inside of his mind. Because at some point, he decided to write a book which is called The Confessions. This is the first book ever of somebody explaining what he really thinks. He's not writing about others. He's writing literally about himself. It's a great intellectual autobiography of how extremely educated person living in sort of the second half of the 4th century becomes a Christian and say, oh, you want to convert you. Well, there's very little hope, guys, to convert you, but you have to read it. It is truly an important book. I'll talk a bit more, but specifically there are many great translations of the Confessions into English. The one which I would recommend is the one by Owen Chadwick in Oxford World Classics. Chadwick is a great scholar. It's translated in a very fluid contemporary English, and it has a very nice set of footnotes and a very nice introduction. It also costs less than $10 on Amazon. So, and if you want to read it, it's a very, it's a really good text to start with. So why is it special? I mean, first of all, it's special because it's written by a very great mind who also possesses great rhetorical skills. It's just a beautiful, beautiful book. It's much more beautiful in Latin than in English, but it's not nor here nor there. Some people even accuse it that it's too rhetorical. Oh, but he was a professor of rhetorics. Sort of, he was teaching people. He was one of the great teachers of public speaking. So obviously, during the great period of public, I mean, he is sort of successor of Cicero, if you like. So yes, you know, it's written in the most beautiful possible way, and you could say occasionally he probably goes too far. Yeah, probably, no question about it. But I like it. I mean, in general, from my point of view, if somebody does something very well, it's good. So I don't mind it at all. Does it read somewhat artificially? There is no natural language? Yeah, it's not a natural language. He builds this beautiful sort of orations. The book is addressed to God. Those of you who might have heard of it taking some course probably think it's full of some racist stories. Nothing of the kind. Indeed, he talks about his love of a woman. That's a fairly tragic story because when he was young, when he was between 16 and 17 years old, it's not quite clear, he fell in love with a woman of a lower social class. You see, we deal with society where class barriers were a major issue. And she became his concubine. She couldn't become his wife because of the class distinction. They had a son, Deodatus, a wonderful boy whom Augustine loved, but eventually they parted under sort of pressure from his mother, and because she was thinking of finding an appropriate wife for him. He didn't marry. He became a bishop instead. But this is the story of how he actually searched for truth. It was a difficult search. First he became a Manichaean. Manichaees were this sect, you could say Christian, but no, not really, who believed that there are two fundamental forces in the world. There is good God and bad God. Because clearly, good God couldn't be the creator from their point of view. Because there's so much evil. Because if the creator would be the only God, then he wouldn't be good, because so much evil is tolerated. So much evil we cannot even escape from it. It surrounds us. So their point of view was that there are two gods, and there is this eternal fight between evil and good, and there are people who follow good. They're elect. They had a small number of elects who would not marry. Of course, marriage clearly, or any sexual activity, but marriage specifically was evil, because it propagates the human race, the evil thing. That's part of the creation. In order for good to triumph, you have to escape from this bodily created existence. So there were these elect, and then there were others who sort of venerated the elect. But the true followers were people who would not marry, who would not eat meat, who would lead extremely ascetic life. So he joined the sect and spent many years with them. Then he discovered, again, I cannot tell you everything which transpires in the book, but eventually he discovers Platonic philosophy. He was one of the people, and there are many through history, who were led to Christianity through studying Platonic philosophers. In his case, not Plato. There is no indication he was actually directly familiar with Plato, but with Neoplatonic philosophers. People like Plotinus, who lived about 100 years before him, and who created, if you like, a theological system based on Plato. Plato, you do not know anything specific. It's all myths, stories, dialogues. Plotinus presents a coherent theological system, and that's what eventually led Augustine to Christianity. He had a profound sense of evil in himself. One of the central stories, I have to tell you in case you never read it, at least you need to know the story in the beginning. He's trying to tell a story of the most horrendous sin he committed. Some people say, oh, this is ridiculous. He tells this totally innocent story. The story he tells that when he is 16 years old, he is on vacation at home from school, and he with a bunch of his friends go and steal pears, fruits, bunch of pears from some neighbor, lots of pears. But they don't want to eat them. They don't care. It's because I had much better pears at home. So what do? They don't know what to do. They find some pigs and feed the pears to the pigs. So why does he pick this as an exemplary sin, as something which is truly, profoundly disturbing? Because he says, this was something I did just because it was wrong. I didn't need it. I didn't want these pears. They didn't taste good. I didn't really have any motive except doing something which was wrong. Again, I don't know about you, but when I look at my youth, and not just my youth, I do find similar things. The things which I did, again, I'm not going to tell you what they were. They're minor, they're like pears, but they are very disturbing. Right? Sort of, in some sense, most of us never had, we're not Attila the Huns. We don't have a chance to slaughter millions of people. But this attraction to evil somehow is in us. At least that's what he found out. And when I look at myself, I clearly see that, yes, he was right. So the story about the pears is in the beginning, but it's central because he understands deeper than just about anybody else in the story of the sort of Western civilization, and not just Western civilization, is this irrational attraction of evil. There's some inner desire which we have to do something which we shouldn't. We know we shouldn't. It was very clear to him. He was not, religious, but he knew that this was somebody else's pears. But he stole them, just for the heck of it. So I do urge you to read it. It's an important document which served as a basis for this entire genre kind of books, which are called confessions. This is not the only. There are 3 books of similar nature. The second famous book is by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. We'll be talking a little bit, one of the great 18th century thinkers. And then there is a very profound book by Tolstoy called also Confessions, which had great effect on Gandhi, and we will have to talk about it later. Actually, Gandhi's autobiography is somewhat in that genre, has some interesting passages reminding me of Augustine. Gandhi knew Augustine, of course. This is a genre which is central, but it's the starting point. Everybody who writes, at least everybody within this tradition who writes confession, starts with Augustine. You have to assume a fairly good knowledge of Augustine in case of Rousseau, in case of Tolstoy. So this is okay. So what happens now? Let me tell you the intellectual history of the next 400 years in 15 minutes. It's a difficult task, but I'll try to do it. So what happens is, first of all, there is a terrible cultural split which starts at the end of the 4th century. It's invisible. Nobody realizes that it's happening. But what happens is that people in the West stop speaking Greek. Greek was the universal language of the empire. And for sure, it was the universal language of Christianity. Christians in, say, as far as Lyon is in France, spoke Greek, wrote Greek in, say, year 200. Only gradually, I say, with Tertullian, Latin Christianity appears in North Africa, not in Rome. Roman Christians still use Greek. But the knowledge of Greek starts disappearing. We see it when we read the confession. Part of it is that Augustine hated Homer. He never acquired fluency of Homer. He was forced as a child to study, but at that point, children of the West no longer acquired a mastery. He never acquired a mastery. Great mind as he was, his Greek was quite weak. Every time he had a question, he had to write a letter, say to Jerome, asking, what does this such and such thing? He didn't know Greek, not really. By the end of the 5th century, there are basically no people in the West who know Greek. So what starts is this great separation between the East, Greek-speaking East, and the West. We have to wait literally till 13th century when people acquire enough Greek that they could start translating Aristotle. And the real sort of Greek learning comes only at the end of 15th century. We have a gap. And again, by now you probably know my opinion of Greek culture, so that was a rather tragic thing. So, the second thing which happens in the West is that the empire crumbles. The barbarians come. They're not necessarily evil people, they're just utterly uncivilized. They do not know how to repair plumbing, the water supply stopped working, they don't know how to repair roads, they close schools. We enter gradually the period in the West called Dark Ages. There will be some remarkable, even literary things happening during Dark Ages. We'll talk about them. And again, these barbarians are central to the Western civilization because my contention, this is right now I could tell you a great secret, that my contention is that our civilization has 3 legs. It's like this tripod on which the cameras are resting. One leg is Greek, another leg is Christian, the third leg are these barbarian Frankish notions from which all of this, when these 3 things fuse, we get the Western civilization. And in great degree, the whole story is the story of this fusion of these 3 things. So we'll have to talk about barbarians. We'll have to talk about how they sort of lived through these periods. But the civilization sort of collapses in the West. There will be, as we shall see, some periods of some attempts to restore it, but it will take many centuries before anything good happens. What about the East? East is remarkable, and of course, all of us sort of have this. If you're an English-speaking person, you know that if I say something, we have Byzantine politics. We have this idea of this sort of highly devious political environment, and there was some of that. We will encounter it with when we talk about Byzantium more during the next lecture, especially specifically about Byzantine politics. But in terms of culture, Byzantium preserves first culture and then develops a great theological and philosophical tradition. It does not stop in the 4th century. There are great names which sort of appear after that. In, say, 6th century, there's a flowering of Neoplatonic Christian synthesis, specifically the work of somebody known as Pseudo-Dionysius, Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagitus. Those of you who will read Acts of the Apostles, as you must understand anything, there's a book in the New Testament. So we'll encounter this person who becomes a member of Areopagus, sort of Athenian court, a great sort of person, of whom we know next to nothing, called Dionysius Areopagitus, member of Areopagus, who follows St. Paul after St. Paul unsuccessful attempt to preach to the philosophers in Athens. Again, read the book of Acts. Very interesting. And very small. But at some point in the East, there appears some writer who takes this name. It's a typical medieval thing. Sort of you take somebody else's name and write a book as if you were him. So there appears that bunch of books which bear the name of Dionysius Areopagitus, which are clearly not by him, but by probably 6th century anonymous Christian, which combine Neoplatonic philosophy in a very direct way. I mean, he literally picks a book by Proclus and rewrites, sort of pagan Neoplatonist, and rewrites it in Christian terms. Had enormous influence through Middle Ages. And then there were many others, sort of the tradition of theological learning in Byzantium goes literally all the way till the Turkish conquest. There are some remarkable historical works. A historian like Michael Psellos, while not Herodotus, is a great historian by sort of non-Herodotus standard. I mean, if you ignore two top Greek historians, he is really great. Well, of course, he is second-rate compared with those, but extremely interesting, but again, highly political. Most Byzantine historians tell us about the court. Right? Another thing which happens that Byzantium does in a sort of this heroic attempt of cloning its civilization. And I belong to this clone. So does Nicholas, to a different clone. Sort of Byzantine decided to convert Slavic tribes, which were a great danger to Byzantium. So they sent missionaries who successfully converted first my Bulgarian friends and then Russia. That created an interesting, it's a wonderful example of sort of what happens if you try to clone the Byzantine civilization strictly as a religious thing. Because what they did, they translated religious texts, but no Homer, no Herodotus. So all the Orthodox nations of the East got half of what Byzantines got. And therefore, they had to wait. They had to wait in Russia till Peter the Great, who brought the rest of the stuff from the West. Russians never got the Greek learning from the Greeks. They had to wait many centuries, till 18th century, that's a long time, to get the Greek learning through the West. And only then Russia, I'm going to say a thing which many, many Russian people will hate me for, but only then Russia became truly part of Western civilization. Because as long as it had Christianity but didn't have Greek learning, it was somewhat isolated and somewhat unable to develop. Right? So there is these two components which are necessary for development. Of course, when Peter the Great sort of brings the stuff, Russia starts developing. Right? It produces great writers, great musicians, great scientists. but not before that. My Bulgarian friends were less fortunate. They had to wait long time because they were after sort of the Christianity was given to them by Byzantines. Turks came, and obviously there was no Homer with Turks. So only at the end of 19th century, they were able to join the Western nations. So it's an interesting history. When we look at it, shows us sort of what happens if you take something and remove it. Right? But Byzantium also possessed this property of it was a defensive civilization. They had a great heritage. They were truly great till, literally the collapse in 1453 in terms of learning. Constantinople was the greatest place on earth. But they were preserving great legacy. They were not developing it. Again, the history of Western civilization, and that's why it is remarkable, is that it always found ways to develop anew, to look at things afresh. And Byzantium couldn't do it. They had great heritage. They were far ahead sort of anybody else, unwashed barbarians, which were unwashed. I mean, every time Byzantines write about Franks mean anybody from the West, they notice the terrible stench. The Westerners didn't wash. They forgot how to wash. I mean, they would wash once, twice a year, which, really wasn't, good. So it took Byzantine and Arab influence to restore at least some sanitary habits. But West had some other wonderful things which we will discover. So maybe they didn't wash, but they had this wonderful element which barbarians brought. So they destroyed the civilization, but they brought elements which we will study later, which allowed all of these things to work together and eventually led to what we have right now. Athens and Jerusalem is the title